That 1930s guy here from, can you guess it? That's right, Chicago. Chicago has some of the most fascinating Depression stories. This is one of the worst hit cities in the country during the Great Depression. Where I'm standing now was a giant homeless camp. This is Millennium Park. It's a nice park now. But this was one of the many places in downtown Chicago where there were large Hoovervilles or, homeless encampments. And that's because about 40% at one point during the Great Depression were unemployed in this city. And I'm going to do a series of videos because there's so much to say about Chicago during the Depression. There's so many interesting things. So you're going to want to watch these videos, and you learn some interesting stuff about the tough times, especially having to do with schools and banks, and you want to watch this. Now on the CTA train, heading towards the Loop early in the morning. And having ridden the Long Island Railroad and the Metro North my whole life, this is kind of a weird alternate reality. It looks like New York, but it's not. The train looks a little older than the New York trains do. Maybe I just got an older one, I don't know. But it's an interesting experience. CTA ride. We're now at the Chicago River, right downtown at Madison Street, which is right there. Right along the river here, didn't quite look like this in the 30s. There was a population, a large population of homeless people, and this was known as Hobotopia right here because it was the largest, or supposedly the largest, in Chicago. Now, Hobotopia was a term that used to refer to a bohemian neighborhood just north of downtown, but the 30s had changed here because there was such a large homeless population living along the river, and supposedly at Madison Street right here, see the sign on the bridge, was the center of it all. And there was a lot of people without jobs. It wasn't, gradually increased in 29 and 30, but 31 came. It was bad. In 1931, with the banking crisis all over, and I'll get into the banking crisis in Chicago, which was one of the worst hit cities as far as bank failures. Nearly half the banks failed, but I'll get into that later. But the unemployment rate they estimated about 40% in Chicago because of the heavy industry here. It was just a prime spot for the type of jobs that disappeared. New York City wasn't hit half as bad as Chicago. New York maybe got up to 20% unemployment at the worst of the Depression, but not nearly as bad as this city did. And if you were homeless, a lot of people lost their homes because in Chicago, a big part of the problem was mortgages. The banks were heavily over-leveraged on mortgages because of the boom in housing in 1920s that occurred in the suburbs. And so a lot of people, a lot of suburbanites who might have lost their money in a bank, lost their homes, and they say the average age of a homeless person in Chicago, they actually did a census one year, was 43 years old. So these weren't young guys. These were, probably people that were had to leave their families because they couldn't support them anymore. And it was a pretty sad sight here. And you can imagine today, Chicago, if 4 out of 10 people didn't have a job, what it would be like. it was a very depressing, intense atmosphere. Mayor Cermak supposedly, no proof of this, but told the President Hoover to have National Guard troops close to Chicago in case the city explodes, because there's just such a terrible atmosphere at the time. No one knew what was going to happen next. And I'll get into more of the banking crisis in a minute. Here at the Amalgamated Bank of Chicago, I think this is an appropriate spot right in the middle of downtown. Talk about how bad some estimates, I believe they were the fifth of all major cities. The only other really big city that was worse than Chicago as far as bank failures was Detroit, but Chicago had the fifth highest percentage of what people lost. The average person lost about what in today's money would have been about $2,500, $3,000. That's the average of what a person lost, because there were so many banks that closed. Like I said, about half of the banks in Chicago were shut down because people panicked and took their money out. And big part of that was real estate. The suburbs around Chicago grew incredibly in the 1920s. The city itself grew 35%. And the suburbs around is, I think like 1,000% or some outrageous number. That there's so many new houses being built in the 1920s that when a lot of foreclosures, and so by the time the 30s, when no one could afford houses anymore, there was one year where there was only 37 new houses built in Cook County because nobody had money to buy houses. I think for a 3-year period, there was only about like 8,000 houses that were built. Really incredibly low numbers because they overdid it so bad in the 20s. And some of it was legit, some of it wasn't. I mean, there was a lot of deals between politicians and bankers and trust companies. A lot of it, unfortunately, is lost to history because it's never actually recorded. But I'm trying to think. There was one really corrupt case where they would have like a circular sort of scheme where they would buy land from the real estate companies and then resell it and put it in a trust, and there was all kinds of crooked stuff too going on, and that was part of the trouble. But the real reason the banks failed was because people panicked. Usually the way it would go was the bankers, the people at the top would let their friends and higher ups know that this probably bank isn't going to survive, and they'd start taking their money out, and then before you know it, word would get around and whisper campaign, and everyone's taking their money out. And if you were lucky, you got there in time before the bank stopped giving out any money. And it's just hard for us to believe today because we're all protected in our bank accounts by the FDIC, but it was risky then, and it took a while for a lot of people to put their money back in banks because the experience they had losing everything they saved their whole lives is pretty traumatic, as you can imagine. I am now at the City Hall, downtown, Chicago City Hall. Nice Corinthian columns there. There's Lori Lightfoot's room at the top. Just kidding. But here's a good spot to talk about an interesting story about Mayor Cermak. He was a Democrat elected in the early 30s to be mayor of Chicago. Actually, the guy he beat, the Republican, Bill Thompson, colorful character himself, was the last Republican mayor. So there has not been a Republican mayor in Chicago since 1931. So it's been a while. Been a heavy Democratic city. But I'll keep walking here. Mayor Cermak, who was the first immigrant mayor of Chicago, not born in this country, and he was a bit of a reformer. But his big story was when Roosevelt was elected, when he was president-elect. He was down in Florida. Cermak was down in Florida visiting, and somebody had tried to shoot President-elect Roosevelt, but Cermak was in the way and wound up taking the bullet for him. Now there was some talk that, at first some conspiracies that the gangsters in Chicago were after him, but that was dispelled pretty quickly because the guy who shot him, clearly hated Roosevelt for whatever reason, wanted to kill him, and Cermak ended up dying, not right away, but about a month later. And but if Cermak hadn't taken that bullet, history would have been very different, because it would have hit Roosevelt, because he was right next to him. So a little interesting anecdote there. Now here's the main building of the Chicago Public Library. There's a lot of branches, of course, but this is the main building. And I bring you here because there is an interesting example of how bad the Depression was in this city. That the Chicago Public Library in 1931 decided that they did not have enough money. Well, they didn't decide. The city decided it, told them that they don't have any money to buy any new books. So between the years 1931 and 1935, the library, whose main business is renting out books to people, couldn't buy any new books for 4 years. They also ended their magazine subscriptions during most of that time. So they had to sort of get creative about what they were going to do, and it actually turned out to be somewhat of a good thing, because they did more like community outreach stuff, more lectures, because a lot of people still wanted to go to the library because they didn't have jobs, they didn't have much to do. So they did that, and they also came up with a great slogan during that time. Their slogan was every book is a new book if you haven't read it. That's pretty funny, but yeah, it shows just how bad things were. Even little things like books couldn't work. I'll end this video here in Grant Park next to my friend Abraham Lincoln, a very snowy Abraham Lincoln. Got downtown right here. Lake Michigan over there, if you can see it through the snow. But just about Chicago. Now Chicago reached its peak population in the year 1950. In 1930, they actually had about 1 million more people living in Chicago than they do today, which really makes the unemployment at 40% that much worse. But as I'll give you a final look at the city. But yeah, Chicago declined in population throughout the rest of the 20th century after 1950. until the 1990s. They actually did gain in the 1990s, and then they lost again early 2000s. But then since 2010, they have been gaining in population yet again. So Chicago continues to rise. But anyway, this was, of course, one of the worst cities hit by the Depression, and even banks that survived and didn't shut down, they lost about 60% of their deposits, which of course means less loans, less prosperity. It was a really tough time, but Chicago survived, and here it is today, still existing, still vibrant and alive. So there is kind of a good end to the story, and I thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and stay tuned to the next one about the teachers of Chicago and Cook County, which had to work for a very long time without getting paid. You'll want to see that one.